Your girl, April's Goddess. The Georgia Peach coming back at you one more again. Let's get in there in the psychology of love. Oh, a minute. Give me just a minute, babes. Change the title here. I can't spell today. All right. Hold on a second. Got all kind of messages want to come through and everything.
Okay, so in this question, you want to give the basic principles.
An act of living and a way of being. Modern philosophy has forgotten this tradition, and philosophical discourse has all but overtaken philosophy as a way of life. Philosophy is not just an intellectual discipline, which can get abstract and divorced from the real world, but is most importantly a way of life that teaches us how best to live our lives. A carpenter does not come up to us and say, "Listen to me speak about the art of carpentry," but makes a contract for a house and builds it. So must we, when confronted with life, put our knowledge into practice, and not be like those who devour books and can astonish others by their skill in argumentation, but who, when it comes to their own lives, contradict their own teachings. Philosophy is a mode of existing in the world, which has to be practiced at each instant, and the goal of which is to transform the whole of the individual's life. Real wisdom does not merely cause us to know, it makes us be in a different way. The goodness of our lives depends on our soul, in which we can make good use of other valuable things, such as health, pleasure, happiness, tranquility, and so on, which can make a real contribution towards a good life. By contrast, a bad soul will create bad desires, bad choices, and the misuse of potential goods. Thus we spiral down a bad life, characterized by vice. The condition of the soul is entirely a matter of developing and understanding fundamental truths about human nature, and as a consequence of those, about the nature of what is valuable for a human being. If we fulfill our nature by pursuing a virtuous life, our soul remains in a healthy state, enabling us to live a good and happy life, even if we experience suffering, pain, loss of goods, or failure. What concerns external and bodily goods do not diminish the quality of our lives at all, for these are ever-changing. Bad things will always happen to us, as if they constantly move in the outer rim of the circle of life. However, virtue puts us back in the strong foundation of the center of the circle, where the soul resides. But people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. French philosopher Pierre Hadot's works, Philosophy as a Way of Life and What is Ancient Philosophy, are an excellent introduction to ancient Greco-Roman philosophy. Hadot emphasizes the importance of what he calls spiritual exercises, which go beyond simply exercises of thought or moral exercises. Rather, they correspond to a transformation of our vision of the world and to a metamorphosis of our personality. These exercises do not only have an ethical value, but also an existential one. The notion of spiritual exercises in ancient philosophy is meant to emphasize, first and foremost, that in the ancient schools of thought, philosophy was a way of life. The lesson of ancient philosophy consisted in an invitation for each person to transform himself or herself. Philosophy's conversion, transformation of the way of being and the way of living, the quest for wisdom. Wisdom is conceived as an ideal after one strives without the hope of ever attaining it. The only state accessible to man is philosophia, the love of, or progress toward, wisdom. With spiritual exercises, philosophy becomes not a theoretical construct, but a method for training people to live and look at the world in a new way. It is an attempt to transform mankind. Exercise corresponds to the Greek term ascesis, which must not be understood as asceticism, that is, complete abstinence or restriction in the use of food, drink, sleep, and continence in sexual matters. It is the practice of spiritual exercises, inner activities that allow not for self-denial, but for self-transcendence. A spiritual exercise depends not so much on the nature of the activity as on the way it is undertaken, with what attitude and method, and with a view to which goal. It requires a complete attention to and focus upon an activity, and implies immersing oneself so completely in the matter at hand that one forgets oneself, much like what is known as a flow experience. To take flight every day, at least for a moment, which may be brief as long as it is intense. A spiritual exercise every day, either alone or in the company of someone who also wishes to better himself. Spiritual exercises. Step out of duration. Try to get rid of your own passions, vanities, and the itch for talk about your own name, which sometimes burns you like a chronic disease. Avoid backbiting. Get rid of pity and hatred. Love all free human beings. Become eternal by transcending yourself. The word spiritual reveals the true dimension of these exercises. By means of them, the individual raises himself up to the life of the objective spirit, that is, to become eternal by transcending yourself. The spiritual progress of philosophy towards wisdom brings about peace of mind, inner freedom, and cosmic consciousness. These three essential aspects of the philosophical way of life all require the practice of ascesis in order to be attained. Spiritual exercises, which are mostly present in the Hellenistic school of philosophy, are not to be confused with those of Spanish theologian Saint Ignatius of Loyola, who wrote EqG Spiritualia, consisting of a series of Christian meditations, contemplations, and prayers. Christianity also adopted spiritual exercises in order to fortify, maintain, and renew life in the spirit, the vita spiritualis, or spiritual life. Spiritual exercises are part of a lifestyle that engages the whole existence. It is the art of living. Adot writes, "The philosophical act is not situated merely on the cognitive level, but on that of the self and of being. It is a progress which causes us to be more fully and makes us better. It is a conversion which turns our entire life upside down, changing the life of the person who goes through it. It raises the individual from an inauthentic condition of life, darkened by unconsciousness and harassed by worry, to an authentic state of life, in which he attains self-consciousness, an exact vision of the world, inner peace, and freedom." One difference between modern philosophy and ancient philosophy is that one did not just become a philosopher because one had developed a philosophical discourse. Rather, any person who dedicated his whole being to living a particular kind of philosophical life without the need of writing nor teaching was every bit as much of a philosopher as those who developed, researched, or founded a philosophy. Ancient philosophy proposed to mankind an art of living. By contrast, modern philosophy appears above all as the construction of a technical jargon reserved for specialists. For Adot, philosophy as an art of living can be traced as far back as Socrates, born in the 5th century BC, and considered as the founder of Western philosophy. Socrates started a new shift in philosophy as the pursuit and love of wisdom applied to daily life. Though the work of the natural philosophers or pre-Socratics were essential to the development of classical Greek philosophy, it was Socrates who taught us how we ought to live, and therefore that we need first and foremost to consider moral questions. Socrates never wrote anything and questioned everything ordinary people took for granted or left unquestioned. He would walk around the streets of Athens and ask others to explain seemingly simple concepts such as friendship, justice, piety, and courage, only for the interlocutor to realize that he did not know how to explain them or would contradict himself. The Oracle of Delphi stated that Socrates was the wisest person in Athens, but Socrates believed he was wiser than others because he was the only person who recognized his own ignorance. Unlike the sophists, would trade wisdom for money and would speak for their own benefit. Socrates would never accept money and would speak to the benefit of the interlocutor. He taught people to listen to their conscience, the inner voice that tells one what is truly right, and if one doesn't know what to say, one should keep asking questions to oneself and others until one finds out. An answer is worth nothing unless it comes from one's own thinking. It is the process of philosophical thinking that counts at least as much as the answers, and the nature of the questioning is that one has to think for oneself. The enigmatic figure of Socrates was a master of dialogue with others and of dialogue with himself. The Delphic maxim, know thyself, requires a relationship of the self to itself that constitutes the basis of all spiritual exercise. Every spiritual exercise is dialogical, insofar as it is an exercise of authentic presence of the self to itself and of the self to others. Our default view of the self as isolated, individualistic, and egocentric is one of the main sources of emptiness, loneliness, and anxiety that increasingly characterize people today. However, this default self is not our real self. There is a higher, more authentic self, which the ancient Greeks called daimon, a self which is constantly aware of its intimate connection with other human beings, with nature, and with the entire cosmos. When our inner daimon is in a state of good order, we experience eudaimonia, a state of good spirit and fulfillment. As philosophers, we must learn how to dialogue. The dialectical exercise requires persuasion, and for that one must use psychagogy, the guidance of the soul. Dialogue is only possible if the interlocutor has a real desire to dialogue. That is, if he truly wants to discover the truth, desires the good from the depths of his soul, and agrees to submit to the rational demands of the logos. Rather than us carrying out rational argumentation, we have to obey the logos and let the living word guide us where it will. That's how we'll find the truth. Genuine dialogue links two souls together. To distinguish this from our common conception of dialogue, we may use the original Greek version, dialogos. Logos designates rational connected thought, which exists in individuals as the faculty of reason, and in the cosmos as the rational principle that governs the organization of the universe. Rationality and clear-mindedness allows one to live in harmony with the logos. In dialogos, participants are transformed in such a way that it would have been impossible through mere introspection or monologue. In his revolutionary work, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, psychology and cognitive science professor John Vervaeke explains that the ancient Greek philosophers had a different conception of rationality than our modern one. To be rational does not just mean to engage in reasonable arguments, logic or propositional knowledge, but also to transform ourselves, others, and the world. It is an existential endeavor that changes our mode of being. This is a process of participatory knowing. Rationality is the capacity to reflectively realize our self-deception and illusion, and the need for self-correction. It is a deep contact with reality. The dialogue intends to form, more than to form the interlocutor or reader so as to lead him to a transformation of his way of life. What is important is not the solution to a particular problem, but the path traversed in arriving at this solution. We turn knowledge into wisdom. This essential dimension prevents the dialogue from being theoretical and dogmatic, and turns it into a concrete and practical exercise. It is not concerned with the exposition of a doctrine, but with guiding an interlocutor to a certain settled mental attitude. We should note that this is what takes place in every spiritual exercise. It is necessary to make oneself be changed in our point of view, attitudes, and convictions. In other words, to struggle and battle with oneself. Socrates was put on trial for charges of impiety and corrupting the young. He was sentenced to death by drinking hemlock. Though he was offered exile, he accepted his fate and became a martyr to free inquiry. Socrates preferred to die rather than renounce the demands of his conscience, thus preferring the good above being and the soul above the life of his body. At his trial, he stated, "It is the greatest good for a person to discuss virtue every day, and those other things about which you hear me conversing and testing myself and others, for the unexamined life is not worth living." Plato, Aristotle, and all the rest of the sages derived more profit from Socrates' morals than from his words. The philosopher's task consists in action. The Roman philosopher Cicero stated that Socrates had brought philosophy down from the heavens and compelled it to ask questions about life and morality. The death of Socrates was traumatic for many in Athens, and one of his followers, Plato, made it his task to immortalize the figure of Socrates as a philosopher, that is, as a man who sought both by his word and by his way of life to approach and to make others approach the way of being called wisdom. Plato kept alive the Socratic spirit in his greatest work, The Republic, and later departed from his master, for a true follower of Socrates is one who thinks for himself. From this perspective, the philosophy of Plato, and, following him, all the philosophies of antiquity, even those which were farthest away from Platonism, all shared the aim of establishing an intimate link between philosophical discourse and way of life. Platonism became the bedrock of Western philosophy and spirituality, influencing Christianity and later evolving into Neoplatonism. The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. Plato's goal in founding the Academy, the first real university, was the creation of an intellectual and spiritual community whose job it would be to train new human beings. This would leave a definitive mark on philosophical life in antiquity. Philosophy could be carried out only by means of a community of life and dialogue between masters and disciples within the framework of a school. It became a distributed cognition that allowed to increase the cognitive power over the world. Following Socrates, Plato believed that virtue is knowledge, the knowledge which chooses and wants the good. Those who joined the academy underwent the slow and difficult education of the character as the harmonious development of the entire human person, and finally as a way of life, intended to ensure a good life and thereby the salvation of the soul. Plato writes the following on the philosophical way of life. That is where all the risk lies for man, and it is for this reason that each individual must leave aside all other studies and devote all his care to research and cultivate this alone. Perhaps he will be able to discover and recognize the man who will impart to him the ability and the knowledge to discern what the good life is and what the bad life is, and to choose the good life always and everywhere as far as possible. If we do not adopt this way of life, life is not worth living, and this is why we must decide to follow this path. We must live every day in such a way as to become masters of ourselves. Above all, we must seek the triad of values, justice, truth, and beauty. These are part of Plato's theory of forms or ideas, which reveal some essential quality of man and the world, and are beyond space, time, and causality. When we ask ourselves the meaning of these ideas, we are talking about the perfect forms of the soul. The Platonic forms serve as the foundation of our judgments on things concerning human life, and are, therefore, first and foremost, moral values. It is what gives value and meaning to this world. This is the essential knowledge of the soul, which the soul possessed before we were born and resided in the realm of ideas. The perfect forms exist independently of and prior to all our conceptions of it. They are the archetypes or first imprints of which objects in the everyday world are imperfect copies. This is known as idealism. The idea that we do not experience reality in the so-called real world, but only its dim shadow, has haunted philosophy ever since. Plato illustrates this in the parable of the cave, which is not just a story, but a myth which represents the perennial patterns that concern the human condition, dealing with reality, knowledge, and the meaning of life. A group of people have been chained to a wall inside a cave since childhood. They are unable to move and can only gaze at the wall in front of them. Behind the prisoners is a fire, and people walk around carrying objects and other living things. Sounds echo off the walls, and the prisoners believe they come from the shadows. They can only see the shadow forms of the objects and mistake them for reality. Little do they know that the shadows are merely appearances forms, that is, appearances of reality. For them, truth would be literally nothing but the shadows of images. When one of them is set free, he looks at the fire and at the real patterns, but they hurt his eyes and appear less clear than the shadows, so he goes back. He is unable to ever leave the cave. If that prisoner is dragged by force up the rough ascent, he would protest angrily and be in pain, which would only worsen as the light of the sun becomes brighter. This is the slow and painful process of self-transformation. Outside the cave, the man's eyes slowly adjust to the light until he can look at the people, animals, water, trees, stars, and eventually the sun itself, the light source that is the life of all things, filling him with awe. This man would immediately return to the cave to tell the others, but would stumble around and be blind to the darkness, just as he was when he was first exposed to the sun. When he goes to the prisoners and speaks of amazing and wondrous things outside the cave, they think he's a madman, and they would kill anyone who attempted to drag them out. Few people will make it out of the illusory world. It is only the true philosopher who can escape the cave into the real world. This is an enlightenment myth of coming into the light through an ascent, which the Greeks call EqG. It is a self-transformative process in which one comes into closer contact with reality, revealing what had hitherto remained concealed. For Plato, this is wisdom, the fullness of being. The Matrix movie, released in 1999, represents this deeply embedded myth in the human condition. The parable of the cave is compared to the Matrix, a false reality created by artificial intelligence through a computer program in order to distract humans while using their bodies as an energy source, and people must wake up to the real world. Morpheus presents the main character, Neo, with a blue pill to stay in his illusory world, or a red pill to see the truth of reality. Just as the freed man goes back to tell the prisoners about the real world, when Neo leaves the Matrix, he states, "Why do my eyes hurt?" To which Morpheus replies, "Because you have never used them before." Plato can be considered as the first psychologist who presented a structure of the psyche, or soul, which remains relevant to this day. It has three parts: reason, appetite, and what the ancient Greeks called thumos. It has no English equivalent, but may be translated as courage, vitality, and spiritedness. We all have inner conflict, which is the struggle between reason and appetite. Reason is represented by man, symbolizing truth or falsity, and appetite, characterized by pain or pleasure, is a monster like the Hydra, whose head when chopped off would regenerate more heads, making it an even more dangerous foe. We often use short-term pleasure for long-term suffering, falling into a vicious cycle that can be hard to get out of. The third part, thumos, is represented by the lion, reflecting honor and shared cultural meaning in society. It is the middle region between reason and appetite. This Platonic division of the psyche can be compared to Freud's ego, superego, and id, though they have considerable differences. The task of Socratic self-knowledge to reduce inner conflict begins with the teaching of man, reason, who can train the lion, thumos, and together tame the monster, appetite. By seeking self-knowledge in order to lessen our inner conflict, we improve our skills and are more in contact with reality. Self-transformation and contact with the world are interlinked. We change in order to see the world, and the world changes by disclosing itself in a new way. Plato depicts thumos as the chariot ride to the soul, to the true, the good, and the beautiful. The charioteer represents the human soul pushed by two winged horses, a mortal dark horse that descends, appetite, and an immortal white horse that ascends, reason. It is only the gods who have two immortal horses. The charioteer must go through a turbulent journey of directing the two horses and stop them from pulling off in different directions in order to reach the heavens, following the path of enlightenment. This path allows us to obtain a clearer vision of reality and inner harmony of the fullness of being, allowing us to be more in touch with reality. The ancient Greco-Roman philosophers greatly emphasized learning to live as well as learning to die. Plato alludes to the exercise for death in the Phaedo, whose theme is the death of Socrates and the immortality of the soul. One who has spent his life in philosophy does not fear death, since philosophy is nothing other than an exercise of death. The philosopher spends his time trying to align himself with the soul and separate himself from the body. the soul to which elevation of thought and the contemplation of the totality of time and of being belong, does not consider human life as important. Such a person will therefore not look on death as something terrible. In this spiritual exercise, we die to our individuality and unhealthy passions in order to elevate ourselves to the objectivity of the universal perspective. A lucid anticipation of death shows the authenticity of existence, and it is up to each of us to choose between lucidity and diversion. For that, we must die every day. He who has learned how to die has unlearned how to serve. We have been placed on earth in order to contemplate divine creation, and we must not die before we have witnessed its marvels and lived in harmony with nature. Those who practice wisdom are excellent contemplators of nature. They examine the earth, the sea, the sky, the heavens, and all their inhabitants. They provide their souls with wings, so that they may walk on the ether and contemplate the powers that live there. The Platonist philosopher Plutarch writes, "Does not a good man consider every day a festival, and a very splendid one, to be sure, if we are virtuous? For the world is the most sacred and divine of temples, and the most fitting for the gods. Man is introduced into it by birth to be a spectator, not of artificial, immobile statues, but of the perceptible images of intelligible essences, such as the sun, the moon, the stars, the rivers whose water always flows afresh, and the earth, which sends forth food for plants and animals alike. A life which is a perfect revelation and an initiation into these mysteries should be filled with tranquility and joy." Aristotle had studied in the Platonic Academy for 20 years before founding the Peripatetic school in the Temple of the Lyceum. While Plato pointed up to the realm of ideas, Aristotle was a realist who brought the attention back to this world. Socrates sought wisdom to overcome self-deception. Plato gave us a structural theory of the psyche to explain how we could reduce our inner conflict. Aristotle, on the other hand, provides us with an account of the growth and development of our character that is connected to a project of wisdom and meaning life. Aristotle brings in the notion of change, how we grow and develop, which makes our lives meaningful. Like a snake, we must shed our old skin and renew ourselves, or die. Wisdom is the ability to cultivate virtues in order to be reasonable and capable of reflecting upon the things that truly matter to us. Aristotle uses the word akrasia for the lack of command of ourselves, which is what prevents us from doing the right thing. Wisdom is not just knowing the right thing to do, but also doing the right thing. To be ignorant is to not know the right thing to do, and to be foolish is to know the right thing but still do the wrong thing. It is a
I'm doing okay, baby girl. How you doing today? Check this out. I'm about to end this stream in a minute because we finna expose a catfisher, right? You know, people really think you for a fool, okay? You know, see, that's why I really don't be on, social media like that. The only reason I really have like Instagram and Facebook is because most of my family, that's how all of them be on social media, and that's how I get in touch with a lot of them. Instagram, it's like I'm a sociable person. I like to meet people, and I always get friend requests. When I accept them, the next thing it's headache. They want to ask you a million questions. Some they looking for. I'm not on here for that. I'm just on here because for being sociable to meet new people. Then I got this one guy. I guess he's a guy. He messaged me a few times a couple of months ago on Instagram and on Google Chat. So I hadn't heard from him in over a month. Now he comes sending me a message telling me he need to talk to me. It's very important. Like that. That's what's so important. Can you call me? I said, for what? I need your help with something. What you need my help with? I need. Do you have ID or driver's license? I say, yeah. What you need? I said, I'm not sending you my ID or my driver's license, none of that shit. You must be thinking I'm a damn fool. I just need it because I need to verify my account. I said, what you need my ID for to verify your account? You need your ID to verify your own damn account. I said, boy, y'all motherfuckers crazy as hell. Y'all think somebody is a fool.
A battle between reason and appetite to cultivate our character, realizing wisdom, overcoming self-deception, and enhancing the structure of our psyche and our
No, ain't on the
contact
phone.
with reality is what it means to be a fully realized, rational being. The words actual and potential come from Aristotle. When we live up to our potential, we are on the path towards a virtuous life, which Aristotle defined as a point between a deficiency and an excess of a trait. The point of the greatest virtue lies not in the exact middle, but a golden mean, sometimes closer to one extreme than the other, such as confidence between self-deprecation and vanity. The ancient Greeks call it eret, the pursuit and cultivation of human excellence that allows one to live up to one's full potential in order to lead a good life. Virtue is the only real good and is necessary for eudaimonia. The practice of ascesis is best observed in the Hellenistic schools of philosophy, who define wisdom as a state of perfect peace of mind. Ado writes, from this viewpoint, philosophy appears as a remedy for human worries, anguish, and misery, brought about for the cynics by social constraints and conventions for the
I'll be back, y'all. I'm finna come back on and I'm finna